I went to lunch with some friends from work and saw my boss and wife at the next table, so I went over to their table and said, "It's great to hear you're dating, it's a shame you were exposed." They were devastated by what they heard and would be even more devastated when they heard what I was going to do to turn things around. It was an epic divorce that she would never forget. The kind of divorce that you don't sign, it's etched into your soul. The kind of betrayal that you don't forget, but transform. I was the kind of man who came home at the same time every day, who bought her flowers without specific dates, who texted her to ask if she needed anything at the grocery store. I was predictable, stable, kind. And maybe that was what killed the spark in her eyes. Because even when she smiled, there was something in her eyes, an uncomfortable silence, a distance that I had tried to ignore for too long. But that day, having lunch with colleagues who barely knew about the torment I was living in silence, life decided to show me what my eyes refused to see. Her laughter. His hand on top of hers. The two of them in the corner of the restaurant where we used to go on Sundays as a family. And the way she pretended not to see me until my voice cut through the air like a cold blade, "It's good to know you're going out together." The silence that followed was deafening. They didn't say anything. They just froze. His eyes searched hers as if seeking permission to speak. Hers searched the floor. I, on the other hand, just wanted to understand how long this had been going on, which afternoons she said she went to the salon and actually met him, which nights she said she was too exhausted to make love but saved her energy for the office. The shock didn't come from the act itself, but from the choreography. From the way they both behaved, as if they were characters in a rehearsed play, and I was the clown who never got the script. The anger that was born in me at that moment wasn't shouted. It was cold. Warm. A calculated fury. Because while they were trembling, I already knew what I was going to do. The betrayal itself was just the tip of the iceberg. What they didn't know was that I already suspected. And worse, that I had already acted. What hurts about betrayal is not just the body that surrenders itself to another, but the complicity. The little lies. The normality with which one lives a parallel life. I would come home and find her smiling, smelling nice, asking me how my day was while she cooked a lasagna that she learned to make in our 3rd year of marriage. Now I understand that each bite was a poison that distracted me from the truth. There was no smell of different perfume on her clothes, no forgotten notes. It was a crime without proof, until that day. The way she smiled at him when she thought no one was looking. The way he touched her waist as if it were already a habit. The naturalness that only comes with time. They weren't just starting out. They were comfortable. That's what destroyed me the most. But what they also didn't know was that I'm a man who never forgets what people do to him. Never. And I knew how to turn pain into a weapon. Divorce wouldn't just be a document. It would be a lesson. A movie twist. And she, who once swore eternal love, would now have to watch, scene by scene, her own downfall. I didn't scream. I didn't bang on the table. I didn't make a fuss. I just walked over, left the phrase hanging in the air like a sentence, and walked away, leaving them both in absolute panic. The game had started there, but the last move would be mine. And she would never forget it. Because there are things that are lost in a divorce, the house, the furniture, the time. But there are others that are gained, power, clarity, coolness. And when you have that in your hands, the world bends. She tried to explain herself afterwards. She sent messages. Letters. She cried. She claimed confusion, fragility, neediness. As if the secret sex with her boss was just a cry for help. I just read and erased them. Because while she was crying over the loss of a marriage, I was building the foundation of my revenge. A clean, calculated, elegant revenge. No violence, no scandal. Just justice. And at the right moment, justice appeared. Her boss thought he could have it all, the position, the prestige, and now the wife of a subordinate. But he forgot that in the game of power, those who move silently win. I prepared for weeks. I uncovered details. I exposed her misdeeds. I gathered documents, emails, digital traces. And then, on the day of the divorce hearing, she knew. She knew that she would lose not only her husband. She would lose her comfort. Her status. Her emotional and financial support. And her lover, well, he was the first to abandon her. Cowardly. As the weak do when the castle begins to crumble. She tried to resist. She looked for allies. She cried to her friends. But the truth was that no one wanted to burn for her anymore. She betrayed me, and with that, she lost the only thing that cannot be recovered, respect. Betrayal stains, and no tears can wash it away. When we met again months later, by chance or irony of fate, she didn't recognize me. I was better. Lighter. At peace. And by my side, another woman. One who looked at me with admiration that I hadn't seen in years. And at that moment, when our eyes met, I knew, she understood. She understood that this was the real punishment. Because while I was being reborn, she was sinking alone in the choices she had made. But what made her cheat on a husband who loved her? What made her trade a stable life for secret encounters with a boss she barely knew how to love? And what exactly did I do to turn that moment of public humiliation into the most epic turning point of my life? The answer to all this, including what happened to her after the divorce, and how fate took care of justice in a way that even I didn't expect, you'll only find out if you listen to the end. Because her downfall hasn't begun yet. She thought losing a marriage was the worst thing that could happen. But she was wrong. The worst was yet to come. Welcome to our channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional, but they reflect deep truths. Betrayal corrodes, hurts, and destroys lives. The purpose of this channel is clear, to show, through intense narratives, how wrong choices can lead to irreversible consequences. Brace yourself. What you are about to hear is a shocking, intense, and unforgettable story. Good story. At first, everything seemed balanced. Daniel's life was marked by a comfortable routine and a love that, in everyone's eyes, had withstood the test of time with dignity. He was a project manager at a multinational company, someone who valued stability, responsibility, and small everyday gestures. He had a calm presence, a firm gaze and a confident way of speaking, the kind that conveys confidence even in silence. To his friends, he was the kind of man who prided himself on keeping his word, who arrived punctually, who preferred to have dinner at home rather than at an expensive restaurant, who found joy in making breakfast on Sundays and who never tired of praising his wife, even after so many years of marriage. His sense of justice was almost inflexible, and his concept of fidelity was non-negotiable. Laura, on the other hand, was pure movement. She had an energy that filled spaces, an artistic sensitivity that made her see poetry in details that others ignored. With a degree in marketing and experience in events, she was a natural communicator, always surrounded by people, smiles and conversations that ranged from trivial matters to deep reflections on life. She had a striking but discreet beauty, the kind that didn't need much to be noticed. When she met Daniel, she was enchanted by the contrast. He was the calm she didn't have, the structure she sometimes resisted, but unconsciously desired. Together, they formed an unlikely couple that, somehow, worked harmoniously. The solidity of one complementing the lightness of the other. They got married after 3 years of dating, in a simple but emotional event. They preferred something intimate, with only close friends and family, in a country house surrounded by old trees and a balcony where, that night, they danced alone after everyone had left. Those were happy years, marked by achievements that they celebrated together, the purchase of their first apartment, the renovation plan down to the smallest detail, the adoption of a dog, short trips during long weekends, improvised dinners with cheap wine and background music. They did not have children, by mutual choice, preferring to explore the world and life as a couple without external pressures. They said that their love was enough, and for a long time, it was. Daniel's work was very demanding, but he knew how to separate things well. Even though some weeks were tough, he always made time to be with Laura, even if it was in small doses, a quick lunch in the middle of the workday, a loving message at the end of the afternoon, or simply sitting on the couch together after dinner, watching something unimportant. For him, it was these moments that kept the relationship alive. As the years went by, Laura began to feel an increasingly strong desire for new stimuli. It wasn't dissatisfaction with the marriage itself, but an internal restlessness that came in cycles, a thirst for change, for movement, for challenges that went beyond the predictable. She tried to fill this void by throwing herself into work. When she got a job as a communications coordinator at a technology company, she became intensely involved with the projects and the team, which was mostly made up of young, creative and ambitious professionals. The environment was modern, dynamic, different from anything she had ever experienced. She was held accountable for each delivery, but also recognized, praised and challenged. The adrenaline of short deadlines and creative campaigns ignited something inside her. She started coming home late, with plausible excuses, but not always entirely true. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't suspect anything. He believed in Laura with the conviction of someone who chose to love without reservations, without the need to watch, control or doubt. The changes, however, began to appear in the details. Laura, who had previously been present and affectionate, became more distant and introspective. Her hugs became shorter, her kisses more formal. Long conversations were replaced by polite silences and short answers. She became irritated easily, as if everything around her was bothering her, including Daniel himself, who was trying to balance his serenity with the growing feeling of being pushed out of something that used to be his place. He began to wonder if it was his fault, if he had stopped being interesting, if age, time or routine had undermined what had once been passion. But even with these thoughts, he resisted. He believed that bad times happened, that marriage was made of ups and downs, and that all it took was a little patience and love for everything to get back on track. There was one night in particular that marked one of these silent transitions. It was Laura's birthday, and Daniel prepared dinner at home, with her favorite food, flowers scattered around the living room, and a playlist of songs that marked their years together. He waited anxiously for the moment when she would walk through the door and be surprised by everything. But when she arrived, with a tired smile and red eyes from a difficult day, his reaction was measured. She thanked him, sat at the table, ate in silence, and went to bed early. Daniel stayed there, alone, looking at the candles that were still burning and the almost untouched plates. He felt a pang in his chest, but he preferred to believe that it was just the stress of work, that she needed time, that in the end, everything would work out. In the company where Laura worked, there was a central figure who orbited all strategic projects, the operations director, a respected man, with a strong voice, a penetrating gaze and an aura of leadership that did not go unnoticed. He was intelligent, articulate and knew how to lead people with precision. He had the kind of magnetism that made everyone want to be around him, to learn from him, to impress him. Laura, naturally charismatic, began interacting with him frequently, and over time, these interactions became longer, more personal. They began having lunch together with the excuse of professional schedules, then quick coffees that stretched on, until the times began to coincide with an almost mathematical precision. But that, for now, was just behind the scenes. The world outside saw only a competent professional gaining space with effort and dedication. Meanwhile, Daniel continued with his routine, committed to his obligations and hopeful about the future. He planned a trip for the two of them at the end of the year, something that could reconnect the couple, remember the good times, and revive what, according to him, never died, it had just gone to sleep. He thought about talking to Laura about maybe slowing down, doing more things together, cooking on Sundays again, and resuming some traditions they had left behind. But there was something holding him back, the fear of seeming needy, of pressuring her, of suffocating her. So he waited for the right moment. The right moment that never came. Weekends have also changed. Previously filled with simple walks, morning coffees and long conversations in the park, they began to be filled with Laura's last-minute commitments, company events, get-togethers, courses. Daniel respected her, but felt her absence. He read books alone, watched films in silence, walked the dog, trying to fill the empty time that, before, was filled with her presence. He began to write letters that he never delivered, silent outbursts on papers kept in the office drawer. It was his way of maintaining the connection, of not losing himself within himself. However, the real change would come in a subtle way, like everything up until then. It wouldn't be through a scandal, nor an accidental discovery. The truth was on its way, and when it came, it would not only shake the foundations of a marriage, but it would also reveal the strength of someone who, even though hurt, would decide to transform the pain into something greater. Daniel didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover that sometimes love doesn't save, it blinds. And when your eyes finally open, what you see can change everything. Laura started wearing new clothes, a different perfume, and her messages became more scarce, less affectionate. Daniel noticed every little deviation with the precision of someone who knows even the silence of a lover. Her absence on Saturday mornings, the dinners postponed by meetings, the smiles that no longer reached her eyes, everything seemed out of place, as if something essential was slowly fading away. Still, he insisted on believing that it was just a phase. That maybe, with a little more patience and space, everything would go back to normal. He wasn't the suspicious type. Trust, for him, was a solid, almost blind virtue. But something, deep down, was warning him subtly. Like a cold breeze before a storm, a muffled intuition that he couldn't name, but that refused to disappear. One afternoon, while having coffee with a coworker, Daniel accidentally overheard the name of the company where Laura worked being mentioned in a side conversation at the next table. One of the people present was talking about a new campaign, mentioning the communications team and the brilliant operations director who had been praised for his innovative ideas. Daniel didn't pay much attention to it at first, but he was left with that uncomfortable feeling, as if he had touched on something he would rather ignore. Later, when he got home, he casually asked about the project. Laura deflected, saying she wasn't directly involved, that she didn't even know all the details. It was the first blatant lie. He didn't say anything. He just kept it to himself. The weeks that followed brought more of the same. Vague justifications, lost glances, absences disguised as professional commitments. Daniel began to observe without confronting. I wanted to understand how far this would go. He decided not to tell anyone. I didn't want advice or opinions. He needed to feel it, he needed to see it for himself. He started arriving unexpectedly at the company where he worked. He got ahead on his tasks to free up his afternoons, and he walked around the city like someone looking for something but didn't know exactly what it was. His silence was not passivity. It was calculation. It was preparation. The love was still there, but it was increasingly stifled by the fear of being made a fool of. Laura, on the other hand, found herself increasingly involved in the new universe to which she now seemed to belong. The director, Thomas, was older, sophisticated, effortlessly seductive. He knew what to say and how to say it, and had the power to make any woman feel unique, even when he was surrounded by others. The interest between them did not arise suddenly. It was built on coffee breaks, on shared laughter in the hallways, on messages exchanged after hours. The game began innocently, almost naively, but quickly evolved into private meetings, improvised dinners, and discreet touches that carried hidden intentions. Laura fought the impulse, tried to convince herself that it was just admiration, a harmless fantasy, a way to fill a space she didn't even know existed. But it grew inside her with frightening speed. The first time she met Thomas outside of work was at a low-key restaurant downtown. He suggested it under the pretext of discussing a new project, and she accepted without hesitation. She felt alive again. The adrenaline, the desire, the risk. There was something there that she no longer found at home, and it wasn't just the man in front of her, but the feeling of being desired, admired, chosen. The night ended with a stolen kiss in the parking lot, quick, intense, and fraught with guilt. On the way home, Laura cried. She knew what it meant, what it could trigger, but a part of her, perhaps the most human part, didn't want to stop. Meanwhile, Daniel was sinking into an increasingly thick silence. He stopped trying to understand. He began to accept. And by accepting, he began to act. He began to observe the schedules, to analyze the patterns, to cross-reference information. He had never been the controlling type, but now, driven by a feeling that mixed pain and the need for justice, he found himself putting together a puzzle whose pieces were appearing every day. A message on her cell phone, read without intention, triggered the final alert. It was a simple sentence, sent by an unsaved number: tomorrow, same place. Laura had left her phone on the living room table while she was taking a shower. Daniel read it, wrote down the number and, once again, kept it in silence. The next night he claimed a business dinner and left earlier than usual. He headed to the restaurant he suspected was the meeting point. He chose a strategically located table and waited. Minutes later, he saw Laura enter. She was beautiful. More than usual. The carefully arranged hair, the new dress, the attentive eyes. She looked nervous but determined. When Thomas arrived and sat down across from her, Daniel felt something inside him break with cruel gentleness. There were no kisses, no explicit touching, but the look between the two was enough, the way they leaned in to speak, the knowing smiles. All it took was body language. There was no need to listen to what they said. What existed between them spoke loud enough. Daniel stood up, walked over to their table, and stood before them with a calmness that surprised even himself. They hadn't seen him arrive. They were absorbed in each other. When they finally noticed his presence, Laura's expression fell. Her face lost color, her breath hitched, her eyes widened in shock. Thomas swallowed hard, straightened his jacket, and tried to maintain his posture, but he couldn't hide his discomfort. Daniel looked at them for a few seconds, as if recording an image to never forget. And then he simply said, "It's good to know you're going out together. It's a shame you were unmasked." Silence settled like a sentence. There were no shouts. There were no questions. Just that heaviness that precedes collapse. He walked away without looking back, leaving them both paralyzed, without reacting. There was nothing more to say at that moment. Words lost their meaning. It was the gesture that spoke. The betrayal was exposed, naked, with no possible defense. Laura did not try to follow him. Thomas remained still, as if he did not know whether to run or hide. From that moment on, everything would change. Forever. As Daniel left the restaurant, he felt a mixture of pain and liberation. The pain of someone who had lost something precious. The liberation of someone who now knew the truth. But what Laura didn't know yet, what Thomas could never have imagined, was that this betrayal wouldn't just be discovered. It would be used. Daniel had something else. An asset. A secret that had been built in silence, with patience and precision. Something that, at the right moment, would completely change the course of that story. And the right moment was about to arrive. That same night, after leaving the restaurant, Daniel did not return straight home. He drove aimlessly for hours, with the steering wheel firmly in his hands, as if he wanted to crush with his fingers the pain that was spreading through his body. His chest was burning. There was no screaming, there was no crying. What existed was a suffocating silence, the kind of silence that sets in after everything inside someone falls apart. The streets passed slowly, the city lights seemed to mock his solitude, and yet he felt strangely lucid. Because something inside him had broken, yes, but not in the way many would imagine. What broke gave way to something else. A type of strength that is born deep within the soul when there is nothing left to lose. When he finally parked in front of the building, it was almost 3 a.m. The building was plunged into silence, as if the entire world was sleeping peacefully, while he carried a collapsing universe within his chest. Laura arrived home about 40 minutes later. She opened the door slowly, as if she were afraid of what she might find on the other side. She called out to him, but got no answer. Only the sound of the living room clock filled the space. She went to the bedroom and found him sitting in the armchair next to the window, his gaze lost, his expression impenetrable. She wanted to speak, but he raised his hand for silence. The gesture was dry, calculated, and filled with a coldness she had never seen in him. She approached him cautiously and sat on the edge of the bed. She said she needed to explain, that she didn't even know how it started, that she didn't want to hurt him. He remained silent for a few seconds, until he finally broke the silence with a sentence that made her heart freeze. "The pain you caused me hasn't even started to hurt yet. Because you don't know what I've already done." She frowned, confused, not understanding what he meant. But Daniel, with the calm of someone who no longer needs to control his anger, stood up and walked to the closet. She picked up a box, opened it in front of her, and revealed dozens of documents, printed emails, photos, and reports. Laura tried to maintain her composure, but her eyes scanned the material with a growing sense of vertigo. Daniel had investigated everything. Not only the affair with Thomas, but also transactions at the company where she worked, projects he had signed with irregularities, conflicts of interest, schemes that involved everything from embezzlement to manipulation of results in public campaigns. Thomas was not only cheating on Daniel's wife, he was also involved in a corporate scandal that was about to explode, and what she didn't know was that, by fate or perhaps by the justice system that insists on acting through the most unlikely hands, Daniel was now the new majority owner of the company where Thomas worked. Laura's silence was broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing. She stared at him, unable to articulate a single word. Daniel approached, knelt down in front of her, and said in a firm voice that he had bought part of the company through a private investment fund a few days earlier, after confirming his suspicions about the betrayal and also after discovering irregularities that had been hushed up by Thomas for months. He fell silent, looked into her eyes intensely, and concluded by saying that he would not just remove her from his life, he would remove her from the comfortable ground where she had grown accustomed to treading without looking at who she destroyed in her path. Laura began to cry. She begged him not to take this any further, not to expose everything, to think about the years they had lived together, the happy times. Daniel walked away like someone closing the door to a burning room. He simply said that happy times could not erase betrayal, and that love, when betrayed, could not be healed with tears. If she wanted mercy, she would have to look elsewhere. The next morning, Thomas's company woke up in a frenzy. An internal memo announced changes in the board of directors, alleging a new acquisition of a majority stake by strategic investors. Daniel's name was not mentioned, but his face appeared later that morning at a special meeting with all managers. When Thomas entered the room, he found Daniel standing in front of everyone as the new interim chairman of the board. The shock was visible, but no one dared to comment. Daniel began the meeting calmly, speaking about ethics, transparency, and commitment to solid values. Laura, sitting in the back of the room, could barely look up. Her face was pale, her fingers intertwined nervously. When he finished his speech, he called Thomas aside for a private conversation. The tension in the office was palpable. Thomas tried to compose himself, to say that it was all just a big mess, that the documents were being manipulated, that there was no concrete evidence. Daniel calmly approached, placed a file on the table, and said that it wasn't just about evidence, it was about integrity, about consequences. And that he not only knew about the betrayal, but he knew about every hidden move within the company. He handed over a written resignation letter, ready to be signed. Thomas stood still for a moment, then sat down with a long, defeated sigh and signed. He said that Laura knew nothing about the business, that she shouldn't pay for his mistake. Daniel looked at him in silence, then said that Laura would only pay for what she had done to him, and that, business justice could not solve. Hours later, Laura was invited to a coffee by Daniel. She hesitated, but went. They met in a small, discreet place, without any symbol of the past. She was exhausted, her eyes puffy, her shoulders slumped. Daniel arrived punctually, as always. He ordered a coffee. When she tried to justify herself once more, he raised his hand and asked her not to say anything. He said that she didn't need to hear any more explanations, that now he understood everything. He said that he didn't hate her, that hate was too strong a feeling to be dedicated to someone who no longer meant anything. And it was then that he revealed what she feared most. He said that he had filed a full divorce, in which she would not have any right to the house, the joint accounts or the assets in his name. Everything legal, everything calculated. She tried to argue, but he interrupted her with a tone she had never heard before. He said that betrayal has a price, and hers would end up being higher than she could pay. And then, when she thought things couldn't get any worse, he revealed the last letter. Daniel said that the day before, he had met with the company's legal department and reached an agreement with the new CEO. Laura would be fired for violating ethical clauses on coexistence, for inappropriate conduct, and for contributing to the instability of sensitive projects due to her involvement with Thomas, the now former director. Her expression became distorted. Her mouth trembled, her gaze lost. She asked why he was doing that. And the answer came with the coldness of those who have loved too much, because you needed to learn. Learn that not all pain is invisible. That there are consequences. And that I chose not to be your victim, but your final point. She staggered out of the cafe, her world spinning around her, jobless, homeless, without the man who had once loved her like no one else. And that very day, Daniel moved on. He left the signed documents with his lawyer, went to the park where he usually walked on Sundays, and met someone unexpected, someone he had already known but had never seen with the eyes he now has. The love story that would come next had yet to be written. But one thing was certain, the pain that had destroyed him was now serving as the foundation for something much greater. And Laura, with tears falling on her lap and her soul fragmented, would only be able to understand the extent of what she had lost when there was nothing left to save. In the week following the confrontation at the cafe, Laura retreated into her own silence, surrounded only by cardboard boxes and uncomfortable memories. She was temporarily staying at the house of a distant friend, but the discomfort of living as a guest made her spend her days wandering aimlessly, avoiding the mirror, avoiding her cell phone, avoiding anything that connected her to the reality that was now suffocating her. The emptiness was harsh, suffocating. There were no more good morning messages, no more weekend plans, and no safe place to return to at the end of the day. Just the constant reminder that everything she owned had been ripped away with surgical precision, not by an enemy, but by someone she loved. And what made everything more unbearable was knowing that this ruin had started with his own hands. Daniel, on the other hand, was not celebrating. There was no euphoria. Just a kind of bitter serenity. The days began to take on new contours. Work was now more demanding, since he had taken on the restructuring of the company where everything had happened, and also because internally he was dealing with the reconstruction of his own self. His meetings with the lawyers were objective and technical. Every detail of the divorce process was handled with strategic coldness. He did not want revenge on paper, he had already achieved that with his downfall. He wanted peace, and he knew that this would only come with time. Even so, a part of him still hurt. Not because of the loss of his marriage, but because of the loss of his own naivety. Because he realized that love, in itself, is no antidote to betrayal. One morning, as he was leaving the company headquarters, Daniel was surprised by an unusual scene. Laura was on the other side of the street, leaning against a wall, her eyes red, her body clearly worn out. He hesitated for a moment, but crossed. He approached slowly, and when she saw him, she straightened up as if trying to preserve what was left of her own dignity. Before she could say anything, he spoke. He said there was no need for that scene, that he wouldn't change anything. But she interrupted, almost whispering, saying that she wasn't there to ask for anything. That she just needed to be heard, one last time. They headed to a nearby cafe, an unfamiliar place with no memories. They sat at a table far away. Laura took several deep breaths before beginning. He said he did not expect forgiveness or return. Who was aware of every wrong choice. But he needed to say that he was lost not because of lack of love, but because of fear. Fear of growing old alongside someone who seemed to never change. fear of becoming invisible within the routine. She said that Daniel's stability, which had once welcomed her, began to suffocate just when she was yearning for something that would make her feel alive again. And when that new one appeared, she grabbed it like someone holding onto a buoy in the open sea, even if it meant sinking her own home. Daniel listened in silence. Her words no longer angered him, only tired him. When she finished, he spoke. He said he understood human nature, that he understood the desire for movement, for novelty. But that love requires courage. And that true courage is to remain, to fight for what you have built, even when monotony knocks on the door. He said that her mistake was not in looking for something else, it was in not having the honesty to say that something was wrong. That he would have listened, he would have tried, he would have changed. But she chose to lie, and lies, once planted, multiply in silence until they devour the entire truth. She lowered her head, tears rolling discreetly, as if she finally understood the real weight of the destruction she had caused. The following afternoon, Daniel gathered the company's board members to make his departure official. The decision, although abrupt, was well received. He explained that he had fulfilled his role, to clean up the internal structure, restore market confidence, and purge the toxic alliances that threatened the company's reputation. And that now, with everything stabilized, it was time to move on. At the end of the meeting, he handed a letter to one of the board members, a recommendation for the hiring of a new communications professional. She had a strong resume, a history of good projects, and an impeccable education. It was Laura. Some members frowned in surprise. But Daniel simply said that everyone deserves a chance to start over, even those who hurt him. His compassion was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign that there was no more resentment in his chest. He was free. Without his company and the burden of his failed marriage, Daniel temporarily moved to a small beach house. He needed some distance. Some fresh air. He took with him only books, a notebook and his dog, a golden retriever named Mila, who seemed to sense her owner's inner change with the same sensitivity with which she recognized the arrival of rain. He spent his days walking on the sand, watching the movement of the waves, reading and writing. He began to record everything he had experienced, as if writing were a way of reorganizing the rubble and building something new. The words, which had previously accumulated inside him like a pent-up scream, now flowed with intensity. And it was in this process that he met someone he had not seen for years, Elisa. Elisa was a literature teacher at a local school and, coincidentally, had also gone through a messy divorce. When they met again at a cafe in the village, the encounter was light, unpretentious, but charged with something difficult to explain. There was no tension, no need to impress. Just two souls rebuilding, sharing comfortable silences and stories with similar wounds. They began to meet frequently, naturally. First to talk, then to cook together, and before long, the walks by the sea were no longer solitary. Elisa listened to Daniel attentively, but never with pity. And that, for him, was liberating. He was no longer the betrayed man. It was just him. Whole. For the first time in a long time. Meanwhile, Laura, even with her new professional opportunity, struggled to get back on her feet emotionally. Guilt followed her like a shadow. She knew her image had been tarnished, and although she knew that Daniel had not exposed the betrayal publicly, many in the company connected the dots. She worked harder than ever, as if trying to make up for the past with productivity. But the loneliness was loud. And the void that had once been filled with adrenaline was now an abyss. She tried to move on, tried new relationships, but nothing worked. Because deep down, she knew, the kind of love she had with Daniel cannot be found twice. And when someone destroys something like that, life takes care of showing, little by little, what was lost. Months passed. Daniel had already finished his book, which is now in the process of being published. It was an intense, personal work, but without names or revenge. Just a story about pain, rebirth and courage. When he received the news that it would be published by a mid-sized publisher, he celebrated with Elisa, with a light, calm smile, as if he understood that life, no matter how much it falls apart, always finds a way to blossom again. On the night of the launch, Daniel was surrounded by friends, new readers, and people who saw him not as a victim but as the author, the man who transformed chaos into art. At the end of the event, someone approached him in silence. It was Laura. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair tied back, and her eyes filled with tears. She reached out, took a copy of the book, and simply said, "Congratulations. You did it." He nodded in thanks. Elisa was beside him, smiling, confident, serene. Laura looked at the two of them for a second too long, then walked away without another word. There was no room for resentment there. Only the sound of distant applause and the certainty that every step up to that point, no matter how painful, had been necessary. Daniel continued to look at the crowd, now with different eyes. I had the feeling that, finally, everything made sense. Because sometimes, for life to truly begin again, everything you love needs to burn until the end. And only then, from the ashes, is reborn what was never destroyed, the essence. After the book was released, Daniel's life took on a different rhythm, marked by a kind of calm he had never really known. It wasn't the same tranquility as before, the one that came from a predictable routine, a stable love, and promises made at the altar. It was something else. A deeper serenity, matured by pain, like the sea after a storm, still rough at depth, but with a seemingly calm surface. The book began to gain visibility in a surprising way. Not because it was scandalous or because it named names, but because it touched, with rawness and humanity, on the wounds that everyone carries but avoids exposing. It was a story about starting over, about silent losses, about betrayals that tear the soul apart from the inside out and leave a space where there used to be ground. Daniel received hundreds of messages from anonymous readers, telling their own stories, thanking him for putting into words what many didn't even know how to feel. This affected him deeply, but not with vanity. It was as if, by sharing his truth, he opened a channel for others to also be free from their own pain. Meanwhile, Laura was facing the consequences of the new world she was now trying to adapt to. Even though Daniel had recommended her for a new role in the company, she began to be watched with a mix of curiosity and judgment. No one said anything directly, but the silence in the hallways, the averted glances and the calculated smiles gave it all away. She was no longer seen as a promising professional, but as someone who had almost sunk a corporation through personal choices. And no matter how hard she tried to maintain her composure, deliver good results and act with the discretion of someone who understood her mistakes, there was a chasm between her and everyone else. The isolation was brutal. And, worse than that, there was the absence of any true connection. Her social life evaporated as quickly as her reputation was eroded. Friends who had previously been there disappeared, colleagues who had invited her to events now avoided contact. She understood, even though it hurt. She knew that her actions had affected not only her marriage, but the lives of many people around her. And carrying this awareness was like a weight on my chest, which would not dissolve over time. One afternoon, alone at home, Laura found an old box of memories in the back of the closet. Photos of trips with Daniel, handwritten letters, notes left on the fridge, movie tickets and small objects that, at the time, seemed trivial, but now carried the weight of everything she had destroyed. She sat on the floor and stayed there for hours, in silence, reviewing each image, each word, as if trying to understand exactly where everything had started to fall apart. And when she looked at her own image smiling next to Daniel, she realized something that until then she had denied to herself: he had never stopped loving her. Even in the most difficult moments, even when she was already distant, even when she had already crossed the invisible line of betrayal. He tried, in every way, to save what they had. And it was she who didn't want to see it. However, time, although cruel, also presents itself as a possibility. Daniel, now in a solid relationship with Elisa, began to experience a new way of loving. It was not an overwhelming passion, nor an explosive desire. It was something quieter, more intimate. It was sharing, understanding, and a connection of values. With her, Daniel felt understood even in silence. There was no pressure, no distrust. And this freed him to be whole. Elisa, in turn, knew what it was like to love someone with scars. She herself bore them. And perhaps for this reason, the bond between them was built with care, respect, and patience. When they talked about the past, there was a rare kind of empathy. Neither of them judged, neither of them diminished the other's pain. They simply acknowledged the wounds and moved on, side by side. But an unexpected piece of news would shake the foundations of this new phase. Daniel's book had been selected to be adapted into an independent audiovisual project. A small but promising production company was interested in the story and proposed turning it into a miniseries. The proposal was respectful, with creative freedom for him to participate in the scriptwriting process. The news spread quickly and inevitably reached Laura. When she heard about the adaptation, she felt the ground shake beneath her feet. The idea of seeing her story, albeit anonymously, told to thousands of people, made her panic. Not because she was afraid of exposure, but because she knew that each scene would bring to light something that she herself was trying to erase inside herself. She tried to contact Daniel, but he politely refused. He said there was nothing to discuss. That the story was his, that the pain was his, and that now he was just transforming into art what had almost destroyed him. This episode rekindled a dilemma within Laura that had been eating away at her day after day. How can you move forward when you are the author of your own failure? How can you rebuild your dignity when everything you were has ceased to exist in the eyes of those who mattered most? She thought about leaving the country, starting over somewhere else, far from the eyes and memories. But there was something holding her back, a need to face everything until the end. Because running away would mean repeating the same old pattern, avoiding, denying, hiding. For the first time, she wanted to stay and face every consequence. At the end of that month, she wrote a letter. It wasn't a request for forgiveness, nor an attempt to get closer. It was a confession. She personally delivered the letter to Daniel's publishing house. In it, she said that, despite everything, she felt grateful. Grateful that he had had the courage to react, that he hadn't gone down with her, that he had shown her that it is possible to rise again even from the darkest ashes. And that, no matter how much she still suffered, she would carry that story as an eternal lesson, not just for the loss, but for what she discovered about herself in the process. Daniel read the letter in silence. He folded it carefully and put it in a drawer, along with the drafts of the book. He didn't answer. He knew that some pains don't need words. He knew that time would take care of putting everything in its right place. But that night, he sat next to Elisa and shared everything. He read the letter out loud, told her details he had never told her before, showed her old photos, shared his feelings as if he were handing a mirror to someone else. Elisa listened without interruption, with a firm and understanding gaze. When he finished, she simply held his hand. And in that gesture there was everything: acceptance, respect, love. The months that followed were spent preparing for the premiere of the miniseries. Daniel attended meetings, rewrote dialogue, visited locations. For the first time in years, he found himself excited about a project. Not out of vanity, but for the chance to leave something for the world. Something that spoke about real pain, about the choices that define destinies, about the human capacity to break and rebuild. At the same time, Laura decided to step away from the company. He asked for an indefinite leave of absence. She wanted to study, reflect, try to rediscover her essence outside of the environment that reminded her so much of what she had lost. She moved temporarily to a smaller town where no one knew her, where she could finally breathe without feeling like she was being watched. He began attending support groups, went to therapy regularly, and picked up old hobbies again. For the first time, she faced herself head-on, without apologies. Their stories followed opposite paths, but there was a strange harmony in the distance. As if life, after collapsing with a bang, was now delicately organizing the fragments. Neither of them was the same anymore. Daniel, now more mature, aware, firm. Laura, broken, but rebuilding. Elisa, a constant presence, calm and true love. And the world around them seemed to turn more slowly, as if it respected each one's time. There were still unanswered questions. There were still sleepless nights. But there was no longer hatred, no suffocating guilt. The past continued to be what it was, a healed wound. But a scar, contrary to what many people think, is not just a mark of pain. It is a mark of survival. And there, on the surface of their skin, Daniel and Laura carried memories that would never disappear. Because some stories don't end when they're over. They continue to reverberate in everything that one becomes afterward. The miniseries premiered in an old theater, restored with the same care that one takes when recovering something that was once grand and was once left to the sidelines. It was a symbolic, almost metaphorical space. There, in the middle of the city, a story born of pain would be presented with the aesthetics of art, and the audience, who barely knew the behind-the-scenes of that narrative, would be immersed in a reality that had been too raw to be invented. Daniel arrived accompanied by Elisa, both discreet, with no need for protagonism. The spotlights, the interviews, the flashes, everything was part of a mechanism that he now understood, but no longer sought. What moved him at that moment was not vanity, but the desire to close a cycle with dignity, to see his story transformed, before so many eyes, into a living, vibrant play, capable of touching those who needed to hear it most. In the middle of the audience, among unknown faces and media professionals, was Laura. Sitting in the back row, she wore a dark dress, her hair tied up simply, and light makeup. She looked like another woman, and in a way, she was. There was no cheating wife, no promising executive who fell from grace, no woman who hid from her own reflection for months. There was someone who now saw the world with clear, wounded, but true eyes. She was not officially invited, she heard about the event through third parties, but she decided she needed to be there. Not to confront, nor to seek forgiveness, but to bear witness. She needed to watch that story from the outside, she needed to understand, perhaps for the first time, what Daniel had experienced from the inside. The curtain opened and, in the first few minutes, the audience's absolute silence was more eloquent than any reaction. The opening scenes showed an ordinary couple, in love, building a home, overcoming everyday obstacles together. The dialogues were simple, full of affection, and little by little the tension set in, a distant look, a smile that never returns, a prolonged absence. Laura clenched her fingers in her lap as she watched the actress who played her look away during a conversation, pretending to be busy while her husband tried to get closer. That performance was a cruel but necessary mirror. There was no exaggeration. There was no cheap dramatization. Everything was frighteningly real. Every silence, every excuse, every detail carried the accuracy of what really happened. Daniel, from his seat in the audience, was not looking at the screen. He was observing the audience. Their reactions. Their teary eyes. Their sad smiles. That was what he wanted, to provoke reflection, to make each person present rethink their own paths. He knew he was not the only one who had suffered betrayal. He was not the only one who had tried to save something that was already dead. But perhaps he was one of the few who managed to transform this pain into a narrative, and the narrative into liberation. As the scene of the confrontation in the restaurant approached, the atmosphere became more tense. The moment was handled with surgical precision, without explosions, without scandals. Just one sentence. One sentence said firmly, surrounded by a silence that said it all, "It's a shame they were unmasked." And then the separation, the walking away, the beginning of the end. Laura felt her heart race. The tears she was holding back began to fall, discreetly, silently. On screen, the character who played her was confronted by herself, by the consequences, by abandonment, by emotional ruin. She recognized herself in every expression, in every desperate attempt to recover something that was no longer there. And it was at this point that the miniseries took an unexpected leap. The focus shifted away from the pain of betrayal and towards the reconstruction of the betrayed person. A man who, instead of losing himself in revenge, chose to reinvent himself. A man who wrote, who healed, who rediscovered love, not as a replacement, but as a discovery. It was the part of the story that Laura knew only in fragments. Seeing it before her, so well translated, was like reliving everything that was never within her reach to understand. When the final episode ended, the theater remained silent for a few seconds too long. And then, applause. Intense, standing ovation. Daniel stood up discreetly, thanked everyone with a brief nod, and left through the side of the stage. He didn't look for anyone. He needed air. Elisa went after him minutes later and found him standing in front of the theater's steps, looking up at the sky as if he were giving thanks for something he never thought he would experience. She hugged him from behind, without saying anything. He just held her hand. And in that gesture there was everything that needed to be said. Laura walked out the front doors. He stopped for a moment in the lobby, as if waiting for something he couldn't name. No one approached her. Nobody recognized her. And yet, she felt like everyone knew. Not because they knew who she was, but because, in some way, each person there carried a piece of that story. When he got home, he sat down at the table and wrote. He wrote compulsively, without filter, without censorship. I didn't know if I would send that letter. But I needed to say it. I had to confess that, for the first time, I understood everything. Now, looking from the outside, he could clearly see the damage, the cowardice, the complicit silence that he had maintained for so long. And that, even though there was no going back, she still wanted to thank him. Because he showed her who she really was. And more than that, for having shown that even the deepest mistakes can be turned upside down and transformed into something that liberates. Daniel, upon receiving the second letter a few days later, felt no pain, no anger, no longing. Just a deep sense of closure. He read each word carefully, recognizing the voice of someone who, finally, saw himself without masks. He folded the paper, put it next to the first one, and let time do the rest. That same night, during dinner at home with Elisa, he commented on the letter, but did not read it out loud. He just said it was strange to think that such a painful story had ended with gratitude. And she replied, smiling, that perhaps this was the most beautiful thing he could have built from pain. At the end of that week, Daniel received an invitation to give a talk about emotional reconstruction after trauma. It was a local university, the auditorium was small, but the audience was attentive. He hesitated to accept, but Elisa encouraged him. She said he no longer needed to run away from the story. He just needed to tell it as someone who had overcome it. And that's what he did. He took the stage calmly, spoke simply, without dramatization, without embellishments. He talked about the love that failed, about the betrayal, about the abyss. And then he talked about the choices he made to avoid sinking. The difficult decisions, the lonely nights, the rediscovery of himself. At the end of the talk, a young woman raised her hand and asked if he still believed in love. He smiled, took a deep breath, and replied, more than ever. Because love is not what hurts us. It is what we choose to build after the pain. Elisa was waiting for him outside the auditorium. They walked to the car together, in silence, hands clasped. They didn't need to say anything. Here were two survivors. Two people who had been torn apart by different stories, but who were now building something together that didn't require promises, just presence. Meanwhile, Laura, back in her temporary city, began teaching sporadic classes at an educational institution. She spoke about ethics, about choices, about the importance of recognizing one's own limits. She didn't use her story as an example, but it was present in every word, in every pause, in every look she gave the students. Life was now moving in different but parallel directions. The story that brought them together and tore them apart was also the story that defined them. And even though they were apart, even with other loves, other cities, other projects, there was an invisible bond between Daniel and Laura. No longer of affection, but of understanding. Of knowing that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand the true value of what you have. And that forgiveness, even when silent, has the power to pacify even the most intimate wars. The road was nearing its end. But there was one more curve ahead. And destiny still had one last scene in store, the one that would give meaning to everything that came before. Time passed with the serene pace of someone who is in no hurry to heal, but also does not forget to heal. Months became more than a year, and with the arrival of autumn, the trees took on the exact tone of what was left of all that, leaves that had once been green now fell to make room for the new. Daniel walked every day alongside Elisa along the dirt trail that cut along the edge of the lake, and on that particular morning, there was a different silence between them. It was not uncomfortable, it was the kind of silence that announces a change about to happen, like the harbinger of a wave before it dives. Elisa had received a job offer in another state, a unique, challenging opportunity, and as much as she felt deeply connected to Daniel, she knew she had to take this step. When she told him, his eyes lingered on hers, and finally, he hugged her like someone who understands that loving also means allowing someone to leave. There were no promises, no demands, just an implicit pact. What they built was real and would leave eternal marks, even if the path from there continued to fork. In the following months, Daniel returned to immerse himself in work, writing, and new projects linked to the publishing company he now managed with trusted partners. The miniseries had won unexpected awards and been acquired by a larger platform, reaching countries he never imagined. But, curiously, none of this had the same impact on him as before. Success was now just a consequence, not a motivation. One of those nights when he was returning home alone, he sat on the sofa and began to write a new story, without a title, with no plans for publication. It was about late beginnings, about loves that arrive when we have already given up waiting for them, about souls that recognize each other not by what they say, but by the silence they share. He wrote without thinking about readers, without thinking about returns, he wrote like someone who is bleeding and at the same time healing. It was there, between words and pauses, that he found himself again. Meanwhile, Laura had consolidated a more peaceful routine. She lived in a smaller city, taught classes, volunteered, and maintained a discreet life. She avoided social media and any exposure. Guilt, although less acute, still visited her thoughts at night. She no longer cried like before, but she still got emotional when remembering everything she had been. She knew she would never be the woman she once was with Daniel again, and at a certain point, she was grateful for that. The new version of herself was more attentive, more introspective, more aware. She was aware that she would never have a love like that again, but she also knew that she did not deserve the same kind of love until she learned to love herself truly and responsibly. One afternoon, while walking through a book fair, she saw a young couple laughing as they leafed through a copy of the miniseries that had been turned into a printed script. The boy was reading one of the main characters' lines out loud, and the girl responded by laughing, saying that he would never have the courage to say that. Laura smiled discreetly and went on her way. She knew exactly where that speech had come from. She knew its weight. And she knew, in that moment, that her story now belonged to the world. That what had destroyed her now served to build others. A few months later, an unexpected invitation arrived in Daniel's inbox. An international literary event would like him to be one of the speakers. The theme was, Art Born from Pain. After hesitating, he decided to accept. He prepared a simple, truthful speech which mixed memories with observations about human nature, about betrayal, about our ability to survive our own shipwrecks. The lecture was a success. At the end, a woman approached him with tears in her eyes. She said she was betrayed twice, that she thought about giving up on everything, but that her story gave her strength. He said he learned that he didn't need to seek revenge or hate. You just had to choose, every day, until the choice stopped hurting. Daniel hugged her without saying a word. At that moment, I knew I had done the right thing. I knew his pain was not in vain. A year later, on a spring morning, Daniel received an unexpected letter. It was from Elisa. She said that she was well, fulfilled, and that, although their paths had not crossed again, she thought of him with affection and gratitude. She said that the love between them was not a love of possession, but of passing. A love that transformed, that sustained, that taught. She said that she was now with someone new, but that the space Daniel occupied within her would never be replaced. He smiled as he read it, closed his eyes and felt a peace he had not felt for a long time. Because there was no pain. Only completeness. Life went on. Each in their own time. Each with their own steps. On the other side of the country, Laura had been invited to coordinate a social project aimed at women in situations of emotional vulnerability. She accepted. There, she used her story indirectly, talking about choices, new beginnings, and dignity. She was listened to attentively and respectfully. And, ironically, she found a purpose in that role that she had never had in her days of corporate prestige. She was no longer interested in power or status. She was interested in leaving something good behind, in balancing the scales of life. Some nights, she still dreamed of Daniel, not as a man, but as a symbol of what she had lost. And each time she woke up from those dreams, she would be silent for a few minutes, as if she were praying. Then, she would get up and move on. One step at a time. In peace. Daniel has published another book. This time, a fiction inspired by the idea of possible rebirths. It has become a reference in events, interviews, spaces where literature meets experience. But what satisfied him most were the silent nights at home, with a cup of tea, his dog sleeping at his feet and the distant sounds of the neighborhood in the background. He had achieved peace, and that was the most difficult victory. The biggest of all. He never married again. He loved other times, yes, but without haste, without dependence, without fear. He understood that loving is a risk, but it is also a right. And that this right should not be denied because of the scars of the past. Now, the sound of the leaves being swept by the late afternoon breeze reminded him of the beginning of everything. Of the restaurant, of the betrayal, of the almost unbearable pain. But when he looked at the present, he knew that this was the right ending. An end with no return. And a new beginning where everything had changed. Stories born from the fall are not about revenge. They are about resistance. And he resisted. Not because he was stronger, but because he refused to stay on the ground. And so the story ends. A story of love, pain, betrayal, reconstruction and rebirth. A story where no one came out unscathed, but everyone came out different. Each character took with them their own destiny, shaped by the choices they made in the face of chaos. And what remains is the truth: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys dreams, values, structures. It reconfigures the world of those who trust. But even so, it is possible to rise again. It is possible to rebuild, and more than that, it is possible to transform pain into something that inspires. If you've made it this far, please comment below on what you thought of this story. We'd love to hear your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more impactful stories like this one. And before we close, we would like to leave you with an important thought: betrayal erodes love, weakens the most sacred bonds, and leaves deep wounds that time alone cannot heal. It has real, irreversible consequences. And although forgiveness is a possible path, we must never forget the value of loyalty, honesty, and commitment. Here on this channel, we make it clear, we do not support any type of betrayal. We tell these stories to show that betrayal is always a path that leads to destruction. Choose to love truthfully. Choose to respect. Because trust, once broken, cannot be restored. It reinvents itself, but it will never be the same. Until the next story.